the skills that they're acquiring are not hyper-specialized, one-of-a-kind bespoke skills that are only good for one thing, but rather are life skills that can enable a variety of successful outcomes.
You're listening to the Happy Doc Student Podcast, a podcast dedicated to providing clarity to the often mysterious doctoral process. Do you feel like you're losing your mind? Let me and my guests show you how to put more joy in your journey and graduate with your sanity, health, and relationships intact. I'm your host, Dr. Heather Frederick, and this is episode 69. In this episode, I chat with Dr. Leonard Cassuto. Len received his PhD from Harvard and is a professor of English at Fordham University. He writes the Graduate Advisor column for the Chronicle of Higher Education, where he shares his expertise and experience from having been on the graduate education frontline for over a decade. In 2015, he published The Graduate School Mess: What Caused It and How We Can Fix It. More recently, he teamed up with Dr. Robert Weisbuck, publishing The New PhD: How to Build a Better Graduate Education. Len, welcome back to the show.
I'm glad to be here. I was glad to be here once, and I'm glad to be here twice.
So last time you were on, we talked about how we are teaching doctoral students to be unhappy. And by the way, if you haven't heard that episode, number 53, I'll be sure to link it below. But at the end of that podcast, I say we barely got to scratch the surface, and we didn't even get into the conversation of, okay, so, well, where do we go from here? So what I was hoping to do on today's call is to have you start with this idea of how is it that we're teaching doctoral students to be unhappy, kind of just recap that for the listeners, and then we'll get into this idea of career diversity.
That sounds great. So let's start with this idea of unhappiness. It's a trenchant phrase, but I think it does not overstate the case. If we take doctoral education, particularly doctoral education in the arts and sciences, and we subject it to scrutiny, one conclusion that is hard to avoid is that it teaches students not simply the content of the subject matter of whatever discipline it is that they're studying, but also it conditions them to expect and desire certain kinds of outcomes over others. The professorial job, and in particular, the tenure-track professorial job, which is in dwindling supply, something that we ought to be doing something about, and I hope that situation improves. But whether it does or it doesn't, we need to regard the situation on the ground that is before us. We teach doctoral students to desire the professorial job above all other jobs. That's first. And second, to feel like a failure if they achieve any outcome but that. So if we reduce this to its most fundamental elements, we can say that if you teach somebody to want something above all other things that you're not in a position to supply, which is certainly the case in doctoral education when it comes to tenure-track professorial jobs, if you teach somebody to want something that's not out there or is out there in vanishingly small numbers, put simply, you teach that person to be unhappy. And that's an indictment that we on the teaching side must reckon with. Teaching is a generous profession fundamentally, and I think that most people who are in academia are fundamentally good-hearted and well-intentioned, which makes it all the more horribly ironic that we're in a position where we are teaching people unhappiness in the name of some higher good. And this, for teachers, this isn't just unethical, although it is that. It crosses the line into immoral. And when good intentions lead to immoral outcomes, it's a situation that demands reform.
And part of that reform could come from just a very simple redefinition of what does it mean to be successful post-degree, right? Because if you don't go into that professorial position, you might feel like a failure. And conversely, in my case, I chose not to chase that goal. And then I had this feeling of like I was betraying my lineage.
Yes, most graduate students did not fall off the turnip truck yesterday. And I think that most graduate students know that professorial jobs are in short supply. However, the socializing process is powerful. And when role models condition you to want a certain outcome, it's fair to say that that can be hard to resist. However, we all, on both sides of the teacher-student divide, which I think we should rename the teacher-student collaboration, both teachers and students have a responsibility to acknowledge what we are now calling career diversity. And here I want to pause and say that you and some of your listeners may have heard the phrase alt-ac in the past, short for alternative academic. It's a phrase that came into wide use, I would say about a decade ago, to describe so-called alternative academic outcomes for doctoral students, whether they finish or not. And that phrase had its heyday, but it is now passing out of use for at least two very good reasons. And one of them is simple, that alt-ac sounds a lot like alt-right. And alt-right is another phrase that has come into wide use since 10 years ago. And it doesn't really do to echo that. But that's enough said about that. The other reason that alt-ac is passing out of use, and this I think is more salient for the purposes of our conversation today, is that alt-ac still highlights and centers the academic outcome, the professorial job. And if we're going to say that we honor other outcomes as well as professorial outcomes, then we should stop phrasing it still in terms of professorial outcomes. And it is worth mentioning at the same time that if we're going to be honest with each other, and we absolutely should be, then we need to say that the alt job today is professor. And so to talk about it as though it's the normative outcome is to do something worse than misstate the case. It is to engage in that kind of pervasive, even pernicious socializing process that can change people even without their knowing it, so that they suddenly find themselves wanting something that is too narrow, too prescribed. It's fine for PhD students to want to be professors. Most of them come into graduate school wanting that. And that's an absolutely logical, reasonable thing to want. We're inspired by teachers we had ourselves. We want to have the jobs that they had. Okay, great. Go for it. We should make that possibility as much of a viable reality as it can be. But while we do that, we need to acknowledge, first of all, the likelihood of that outcome, which is increasingly small. And second, the viability of other outcomes to provide fulfillment and, to go to the key word of this podcast, happiness.
Yes. So if success becomes not just landing that job, but being in a rewarding position that has possibilities for career advancement, it really opens up the door to many possibilities that could bring you happiness.
Absolutely. So something that I say to every graduate student audience that I talk to, and I talk to a lot of them around the country, and this came up in the previous podcast, but it bears repeating because I always repeat this, that if you're a graduate student, the first thing you have to understand is that you are the CEO of your own graduate education. You're the CEO because you're not a sole entrepreneur. There are people who are alongside you, advising you, helping to guide you. But as the CEO, the choices are yours. And that is entirely appropriate because you are the one who has to live the consequences of those choices. So you're the one who should be making them. Own the idea that you are the CEO. Own the fact that not only are the choices going to be yours, but generating the universe of possible choices is likewise your responsibility. Now, I get asked a lot by graduate students as well, this is the only thing that I've ever prepared for. The only job I ever wanted as a grown-up is to be a professor. How can I figure out what to go for? Or I'm a student of X, let's say anthropology. What kind of other jobs can an anthropologist do? Substitute your discipline's name here. Those are good questions. And it is important for us to approach them in the same kind of open spirit that we are using to generate this idea that there are alternatives in the first place. And in response to those questions that I just asked myself, which I'm now going to answer, the first thing to say about them is that they are personal choices, because each person is not a cookie that's stamped out by the same size cookie cutter as was used to stamp out the student who's standing next to you. We end up in this place, in this case, doctoral education, from different paths and with different interests, preferences, proclivities, and different special talents. So here's an example. Let's say I grew up riding horses, and I love riding horses, and I'm a graduate student and I'm looking for something else to do. Well, my advisor may have no idea that I loved riding horses, or maybe that every once in a while I go out of town and I go to a horse farm and I hire a horse and I gallop around for a while because this is something that I love to do. It's my hobby. Well, my advisor knows nothing about this, but if an advisor or a career services officer did know something about it, maybe they would direct me to the jobs that may exist in equestrian culture. There are publications that connect to equestrianism, and maybe I'm an English student and I can be a communications person for an equestrian association, or maybe I can join an equestrian magazine and connect with this thing that I love that is absolutely different from the person who's studying next to me. That person might have their own thing. Maybe that person loves playing bridge, and there are bridge associations too. So I'm choosing this based on hobbies, but it's more than hobbies. There are all kinds of choices that can be generated based on people's going concerns. If you have particular political commitments, you can follow them into a municipal, state, or national government job if you target and pursue those things. And contouring your doctoral education so that it can enable you to pursue the widest range of choices while eliminating the fewest of them is part of the art of going to graduate school in the 21st century.
Yes, the message I really got when I was in that part of the book was, wow, we really don't do a great job of articulating these transferable skills that you get while you're in a doctoral program. So yes, maybe that professorship works out and great, but what if you opened your mind to think, I could be taking all these skills that I'm using to conduct this research, to write this dissertation, and do something totally different that could be as equally rewarding.
Yes, I'm glad that you brought that up. That among the various sins that we in the doctoral education business commit regularly, it is to teach our students that their skills are narrowly applied, should be narrowly applied, that if you're studying for that doctorate in anthropology, it fits you to be an anthropologist. That kind of hyper specialization, that's what you can do and nothing else. Well, there are a couple of things to say about this. The first is that all doctoral students are becoming or have become information specialists. This is something that all doctoral education confers on all doctoral students. Doctoral students are experts at information. They're experts at finding it, at organizing it, at teasing out its meanings, its many meanings in many cases, and at redacting it, synthesizing it, expanding it. And finally, and perhaps most important, doctoral students are experts at teaching it, not just in a classroom setting, but teaching can take place in writing as well, and it can take place formally or informally. So the idea that teaching is part of the American doctoral education, that's because teaching is in its own way a skill. These are all broad and transferable skills. And in this sense, we need to think of doctoral education not simply as specialized content education, although it is that. It's also an extension of the kind of general education that American college students receive in pursuit of a bachelor's degree. When we look at doctoral education this way, its possibilities open up. That if I do a doctoral dissertation on French literature of the 17th century, it doesn't just prepare me to study French literature of the 17th century. And this is a truism. And it's easy for a doctoral student to say, well, I can study French literature of any century. Well, you know what? You can also study literature of any century. And if you know how to study literature, you know how to study text. Well, the whole 21st century world is filled with texts. So your expertise is in no sense limited in this way, except to the extent that you allow it to be limited yourself. I have a fellow professor friend who loves being a scholar. And luckily she's a professor, and so she can do her scholarship comfortably within the confines of her job and her discipline. If she were not a professor, she has said she would find another way to be a scholar. I know that when I was contemplating entering graduate school, I didn't think of myself as much as a scholar as so much as a writer. And figuring out how to be a writer is something that I learned to do while I was a professor. That is, I don't just do scholarly writing. I do all different kinds of writing because that kind of writing gives me pleasure along with the kind of scholarship that is supposed to be my bread and butter. So being able to take any job, whether it be a professor's job or a job outside of the academy, and make it your own, contour it so that it centers on the activities at which you have both expertise and which have the capacity to give you pleasure, is what career diversity is all about. But it's also what living a healthy and happy life is all about. And here I want to segue briefly to the idea, and this is something I've noticed over these many years that I've been doing this work, that when people enter graduate school, they already know how to look for a job outside of the academy because they've been outside of the academy. You have to figure out what you want to do and hunt down the kinds of listings that reflect what it is that you want to do, or in some cases, start doing it on your own and sell the good or the service. So there's a way that looking for a job is an applied creative act, that you are entering into a messy, tangled field and sorting it out and figuring out what's my place in this field. And there's a way that before people go to graduate school, they understand that when you're looking at this thing that you will one day look back at and say, this is my career, that this is something that people are going to do, sometimes multiple times in their lives. So it's a curiosity that when people go to graduate school in order to specialize, many of them unlearn this skill of approaching the tangled and messy field of employment and sorting out where your place is in it. It's pretty easy to apply for academic jobs. And don't misunderstand me here. They're not easy to get because there are very few of them. And there are a lot of people who are trying for them, but applying for them is strikingly easy. The information about which openings are where are in a small number of places based on your discipline. So it's a total information game. You can get information about every single opening that you might fit in the world of professors. Once you've located those openings, the rules for applying to them are unambiguous and clear. And with the help of usually an advisor or two, you can put yourself forward. You need to do the best job you can, of course, but how to do it, how to write a good CV, how to write a good cover letter. I've written columns about these things, and so have other people. The information is out there. So the instructions about how to apply are also, if not perfectly transparent, certainly clear enough. And they can be mastered with the use of the resources that most people have around them in graduate school. So applying for academic jobs is actually pretty simple and straightforward, as opposed, as I said, to getting them. This encourages a kind of complacency because identifying and applying for and getting jobs outside of the academy is more complex. It's more creative, but it has more thickness to it. There are more layers. There are more possibilities. And if you're in graduate school and you're contemplating the world outside of academia, yes, it's a world that you're going to have to use your information skills to research, to sort through that information. This is something that you've become uniquely qualified to do. I talked to a guy who is accustomed to hiring PhDs, who was running a public relations firm outside the academy. And he said that he loves hiring PhDs. He said they have this great skill set that somebody else paid for. And
Right.
he found that he could start them in middle management and watch them soar. And that skill set, that's an information skill set. And the information skill set is readily applicable to the actual act of looking for work itself. So if you have unlearned the capacity to face the field of employment outside of the walls of the university, you are amply well trained and qualified to relearn it and to do it with the kind of eagerness and excitement that it deserves. And the reason it deserves it is that there is abundant data on outcomes that shows that people who have ventured outside of the academy and found jobs have also found their bliss. That is, the job satisfaction of PhDs who work outside the academy is not only very high, but according to one of the most important studies called 10 Years After, it's even a little higher than the people who got their PhDs and stayed in the academy, which is a finding that we ought to take careful note of and plant a flag in.
And that's such an important finding that not only were they slightly more satisfied, but I believe they were asked a question, something along the lines of, knowing what you know now, would you have done it? Would you have completed your doctorate? And the majority said, yes, absolutely. And that brings me to this other group of people who drop out towards the end. There may be a group that is getting to the very end, seeing what's out there, going through the revision process, it's stretching on for years and saying, forget it. I'm probably not going to get a job in the academy anyway. But if we were having conversations about the skills that you obtain by completing the degree that set you up for these jobs beyond the academy, that would have a great possibility of bringing you life satisfaction, maybe that would impact completion rates.
Yes, it might raise the completion rate and keep some people in. People don't complete for a lot of reasons. And the study of non-completers in graduate education is quite limited up to now. Although the Council of Graduate Schools is right now engaged in a long-term study that is a kind of sequel to the 10 Years After study that I mentioned a minute ago. And they are tracing outcomes 1 year, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years out of different cohorts in different fields. And I think that we'll learn a lot about non-completion as well from that study. At least I hope we will, because the attrition rate from doctoral programs in the arts and sciences is about 50% nationwide, which is a shocking statistic on many levels, starting with the fact that almost no one knows it. Students don't really know it. And I know from my own personal experience, most professors don't know it either. Think of a workplace that half the people don't even finish the training program. And then of the ones who do, more than half of them don't even wind up working in the field. The idea that we have not engaged these facts and reformed our practice accordingly before now is a disgrace, frankly. And it's a good thing that reforms are beginning and have been underway for some years now, but not nearly enough years. In my own home field of English, my disciplinary association is the Modern Language Association. And in 1997, the president of the Modern Language Association, they're elected to serve for 1 year. And the presidency is a kind of bully pulpit where the president identifies the issues that he or she wants to spotlight during their term. In 1997, the president was Elaine Showalter, who was an English professor at that time from Princeton. Now she's emerita. And Showalter decided that her issue was going to be what today we called career diversity. She didn't have a name for it then, but she was talking about job outcomes outside the academy. And she tried to make that into a point of discussion so she could start initiatives going forward. Well, Showalter's year-long initiative on this front was met with fierce opposition from the start and was essentially stifled. It was strangled in the cradle. People didn't want to hear it. And the academic job market in 1997 was pretty bad. It's worse now, but it was pretty bad. The conversation was in every way justified. And as a profession, not only professors, but also graduate students essentially refused it. Now, that changed in the crash of 2008. There aren't too many good things about financial crashes or pandemics for that matter. But the financial crash of 2008 and then the pandemic of 2020 have both sharpened the focus on the situation, the academic job market situation. The academic job market has gone from troubled to withered, from straightened to choked off. There are so few jobs that it essentially tore away the fig leaf, the idea that we could just be patient and wait and things would get better again. Well, after 2008, I think that there was much more of a willingness to face the fact that it's a new normal. It really had been a new normal for decades, but the realization that we could talk about it differently increased after 2008. That's around when I started getting involved in the graduate school enterprise. And there are pockets of receptivity around the country which have grown. And there's a willingness to engage these ideas that was not present at one time. And again, not much good about pandemics, but the pandemic made it even clearer that if graduate school is going to find a sustainable path forward, it has to be a path that encompasses career diversity.
Okay, so let's talk about career diversity. Last night, I did a little exercise. I went onto the website that you talk about in your book, Imagine PhD, and I'm not on the job market, but I pretended like I was. And I did the assessments that they have on there. They have a values test, an interest test, an assessment test. They're very short. They're to the point. They're engaging. I found them very interesting. And you fill these out, and then at the end, out pops these career families, and you can click on them, and for example, in my case, it said, "Hey, Heather, you've matched with marketing. And here are PhDs who are working in marketing, and here are their job titles." So I took some of these job titles and I headed over to a job search platform and I popped them in, and I found a number of jobs that sounded really interesting and also started, I think the starting was like $130,000. These were all job descriptions that described skills I had learned 20 years ago when I was in graduate school.
Let's take that story of yours and talk more broadly about the idea of utility. And here, do a little history lesson. The best single book probably that's ever been written about American higher education is by a historian named Lawrence Veysey, Veysey, and it's called The Emergence of the American University. And the book came out in 1965, so it's more than 55 years ago. And the book is so magisterial that only one person has really tried to cover the territory that Veysey covered in any depth and detail since, Julie Rubin of Harvard, who wrote a very good book herself. But Veysey's book remains a towering achievement because he went deep into the archive, deeper than anybody ever has. And he tried to organize the ideas that surrounded the founding of American research universities in the decades that followed the Civil War, particularly the 1880s, 1890s, the early 1900s. That was when the majority of American research universities were founded in the years before the rapid expansion of the field following World War II. So Veysey, looking at this profusion of universities and studying all of the ways in which they came into being, he concluded that the American university is driven by three frequently conflicting imperatives. Sometimes they overlap, but more often they conflict. And those three imperatives are, first, research. No surprise, they're research universities. And so the pursuit of knowledge, or investigation, as the people who were founding these universities like to call it. The second imperative after research is liberal culture, which is not simply a kind of refinement, but also a sort of an ideal of freedom of thought enabled by liberal arts education. And so the ideal of liberal culture is something that is most fully realized on the undergraduate level in this theory. And so the liberal culture, in a sense, conflicts with research because it has an undergraduate emphasis, whereas research is pulling towards the graduate side. And also liberal culture emphasizes teaching, whereas research emphasizes the idea of pursuing information with graduate students sort of tailing you, learning how you do it, but not because you're teaching them, because they're copying you. So you have research and you have liberal culture. The third imperative, says Veysey, is utility. And this is a distinctly American idea in the sense that the European research universities, which partly, but not fully, inspired the American models, they don't celebrate utility. They were temples of learning. And I use the term temples advisedly because European universities, as the historian David Laborie has said, they perch in between church and state. Whereas the American universities perch between market and state. There are any number of institutions in the United States that are affiliated with religious denominations. But in terms of the existence of the university in society, in the United States, the university exists between market and state. And the presence of the market in the history of American higher ed helps us to understand the prominence of utility in American higher education from the beginning. Now, there have been arguments over the years that we need to pursue learning for its own sake. But in the United States, those arguments, while they get heard, they don't get endorsed. In the United States, it's very difficult to conceive of universities that don't have a utility-based component, a component that has a market basis and which directly serve the needs of the public. Now, universities, of course, have the power to shape the needs of the public in certain ways, but the acknowledgement of utility, it has been often said by me that we in academia ignore utility at our peril because the people who attend universities are very concerned, and these days increasingly concerned with utility. The idea of how am I going to get a job? It's an important question because if we're going to ask people to spend their money, we need to be able to provide them with some kind of assurance that they're not wasting it. and that education is not only something that can bring pleasure, but something that is also marketable. And your story is a perfect case in point of how graduate school has a utility-based component, but a lot of what we have to do is awaken ourselves and our students to it. And sometimes that will mean altering the contours of our classes in a certain way. I have taken to assigning more collaborative assignments in the last, I'd say, 15 years because of a growing awareness that the skills that are involved in collaboration, while not often taught in the humanities, are nevertheless skills that are becoming increasingly useful, both within and especially outside of academia. And that if students are going to get jobs outside of academia, then I should do what I can to help build some of those skills that will help them do that without compromising the disciplinary content that I'm imparting, either in graduate school or on the undergraduate level.
You know, one of the things that you write about in that chapter on career diversity was something called a Dissertation Manifesto. And I thought, what a brilliant idea. And it was described as just this 2 to 3 page summary that a candidate would put together, maybe at the end of their dissertation or doctoral project, that really sounded like a reflection piece, really pulling together and articulating all the skills that they learned while they were in their program. And I was thinking, wow, I would love to see that as a required part of every oral defense. So here you are at your oral defense, and your committee is so excited for you that you've completed this research and you're presenting this research. But hey, as a group, let's pause and reflect on all these things that you learned that will serve you in a career beyond this degree, whether you stay at the university or go on to do other amazing things and have some sort of other career.
That's a good basis for us to come to closure on this, because imagine that you and I are working together next to each other, and when you're not looking, I slip a set of wrenches into your pocket and you don't know it. And then after a while, we part ways. We've worked together, and I congratulate you and I wish you Godspeed. And you go out into the world and you encounter a door with a broken lock, and you need to take that lock apart in order to get through the door. But you can't get the nut out because you don't know there's a wrench in your pocket that will help you get through that door. Well, we who teach graduate school have been putting a lot of wrenches in people's pockets without telling them that they have those wrenches. And to remind graduate students that the skills that they're acquiring are not hyper-specialized, one-of-a-kind bespoke skills that are only good for one thing, but rather are life skills that can enable a variety of successful outcomes is one of the hallmarks of career diversity. And this idea of this statement where you reflect on your learning, first a shout out to Lucy Partman, who got a PhD at Princeton recently and is now a postdoc there as she prepares her own likely extramural career. Lucy wrote a piece for Inside Higher Education, which is free and available on the web, that talks about and advocates for graduate students writing this kind of statement and ideally working it into their own dissertations as a coda, which she did with her own, and very well, I might add. I think that this is something that we should be advocating for, looking more closely at, because, and this is the final keyword here, reflection. Reflection, which is what Lucy Partman is promoting here. The idea of reflection helps all of us come to grips with what it is that we have just done, what we've learned, what we can do with it. If we think about PhD education as a single-use widget, it does a discredit to centuries of learning and also the years that you yourself have put into your own learning. That to give PhD education its full credit is to acknowledge not only its specific applications, but also its general applications and the wide variety that those applications have. And if reflection is a way to get us there, then we should do a lot more of that. And it seems to me that it is.
So it's time to empty those pockets.
It is.
Lynn, I just want to thank you for spending time with us today, and I'll have links to everything we talked about in the show notes below.
It's been a pleasure to be here once more.
Thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to connecting with you on the next episode. Until then, I'm wishing you more joy in your journey. The Happy Doc Student Podcast is brought to you by expandyourhappy.com, and you can learn more there. Hey, one more thing. Just a quick reminder that the information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only.